It's been 6 weeks since we've been together. It's been a long time, and a lot of us are ready to get back together again because of the advice given to us by medical professionals and government leaders. We're staying away from one another right now, staying in isolation, in quarantine, because that's what's best. That's what will save lives. That's what will help us navigate this crisis. But that doesn't mean we're not looking forward, even longing to be together again. And because of that longing, and because we've been in this situation for so long now, I thought I'd choose one of the songs of ascent as my text for this morning. It'll be Psalm 123. Now, the songs of ascent are a collection of songs in the Psalms located in Psalm 120 through 135. They're songs that the Israelites would sing when they were on pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate one of the feasts like Passover or Pentecost. And all of them have as a character of these psalms an anticipation of being together, a longing for Jerusalem, a desire to get to Jerusalem and to worship in the temple. And you'll see that if you read through them. That's an element in every one of those psalms. Now, in order to really understand what's going on there, you have to understand a little something about the way the Israelites worshiped before the time of captivity. A lot of us think that they were always worshiping in synagogues, but they didn't have synagogue worship until after the captivity days. Before that, worship at the temple in Jerusalem was a once-a-year kind of thing for most people. It was limited to a specific place, specific people, specific times. And the other times of the year, they would spend the Sabbath isolated in their homes, worshiping in small groups, mostly family groups, just as we have been doing for the last 6 weeks. I know that sounds very different from the way we usually picture worship in Israel before the captivity time, but that's really what's been right under our noses in the Old Testament. We just don't pay attention to it a whole lot. For example, look at Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3. This is a law regarding the Sabbath. And what does it say? 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. Now look at this next part. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. Does it sound here that he's talking about the normal circumstances being worship in big gatherings at the temple? No, he says this Sabbath is to be celebrated, to be observed in all your dwelling places, at your homes, just like we are worshiping in our homes. That was the norm for Israel in the days before synagogues, before captivity. They did several things. Of course, they honored the Lord's command to rest and do no work. And they also had several expressions of worship that they would observe. Some examples are given in Psalm 92 if you want to look. One is to give thanks, and another example of something they would do where it was to sing praises. But they gathered together in homes, isolated from one another, and on special occasions they would go up to Jerusalem to celebrate one of the festivals, or they would go to give a peace offering, or they would go to make a vow to the Lord, or for some other special occasion like a dedication of a child that had been born. And it was a happy time. It was a time of great anticipation of the assembly. And today I'd like to look at Psalm 123 that shows that anticipation. And as you read the psalm, you can see a progression from individual to group as people are gathering together on pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Sabbath. In verse 1, there's just one person speaking in the first person singular. He says, "To you I lift up my eyes." But people start gathering together as you get to the end of verse 2. Our eyes, note the plural, our eyes look to the Lord our God. Have mercy on us, he says in verse 3. So more people are gathering together as they're headed towards the assembly. There's a third group mentioned as well at the end of the psalm, a group of scornful people outside the assembly that look upon the believers with contempt. That's how we're going to outline the lesson. We're going to look first of all at the individual who worships in isolation, and then secondly we're going to look at the anticipation of the assembly, and then finally we're going to look at the group of those who look out from the outside with scorn or with contempt toward the worshipers. The individual in isolation. What does he do when he's away from the assembly? He says, I look to the Lord. He says, to you I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. He looks to the Lord. He lifts up his eyes to the one who's enthroned in the heavens. In Psalm 121, which is also one of the songs of ascent, he looks to the hills. And here he looks beyond the hills to the one who is above all, to God. And his gaze is directed upwards, not because he believes that God lives up in the sky or anything superstitious like that. He looks upward because that's symbolic of the heavens where God dwells, the spiritual dimension. I remember when I was on a trip to Peru and visited Machu Picchu in Peru, the tour guide was talking about how they built all of these Inca temples up in the mountains as high as they could get. And she said, in every civilization, it seems that people think they're getting closer to God the higher that they go. And I thought about that a lot. There's a lot of truth to that. Even the idolaters that you read about in the Old Testament would put idolatrous shrines and temples in the high places because they thought that they were getting closer to the gods the higher that they went. The Celtic people call high places thin places where heaven and earth start to blend together. And so upwards, up to the heavens, that's symbolic of where God dwells. We're not to read into this any kind of superstition like the psalmist thinks that God flits about the sky like a swallow or that he lives on puffy clouds. But he's looking up towards the place where God dwells in the spiritual dimension of heaven. That's where his eyes are directed as he's in isolation and he's not with the fellow believers that he longs for. And this is not as easy as it looks. When we're discouraged, what do we usually do? We're usually inclined to look downward or to look inward or to look anywhere else but the Lord. But we have to fight that inclination to look away from him and look towards him when times are tough. And if we find that difficult, if we find it difficult to see him when we look for him, we can at least look towards where he is. And as we search for him, we are promised that we will find him. I think there's an interesting example of that in John chapter 20. After the Lord has raised, Mary couldn't see the Lord when she looked into the tomb, but she went to the tomb. And the disciples, they couldn't find the Lord either, but they gathered together in an upper room on the first day of the week, the day of his resurrection, to worship. And he presented himself to them there. And what does John say when he finally presented himself to them? When the doors were locked all around him and he appeared and he said, "Peace be with you." What did John say about that? He said, then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So maybe we're finding it difficult to see the Lord. Well, we can at least look toward where he is, and as we do that, we will find him, and when we find him, we will be glad. The psalmist had the right instincts here, to look upward, to look towards the heavens where God is. That's the very best thing that we can do when times are difficult for us, and we will be glad. His behavior here indicates a number of things. For one thing, it indicates integrity. He was alone. Maybe it was him by himself, or maybe this is a father leading his family. Nobody was looking over his shoulder. There were no religious leaders instructing him of what he must do. On his own, he looked to the heavens where the Lord is. He looked to God, which tells us that's what he did in every situation when people were watching or when they're not watching. Being a person of integrity means being an integrated person, being the same person outside that you are on the inside, doing the same things when people are watching that you do when nobody's watching. This was a person of integrity. Secondly, we also see his helplessness in all of this. He's crying out to the Lord as he looks to them. He's probably saying something similar to what he says in Psalm 121, where he says, verses 1 and 2, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He refers to the help that he gets from the Lord. That's an interesting word there. The word translated help. It's the same word that the Lord used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, when he is talking about Adam, his only human creation at that point. And he said, it's not good for the man to be alone, but I will make him a helper fit for him. That description of the woman who had become Eve, that description comes from the same language that's used in Psalm 121 to describe the Lord. And it has to do with companionship, friendship, sufficient help. The Lord is all of that to us. And when we're helpless, we know we can cry out to him. We also see here humility in that phrase, I look to the Lord. I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. Look at verse 2. He says, behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maidservant to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God. That language shows this true humility, the humility of a servant towards his master. And because we know that is behind the look that he has towards heaven, we know several things about it. We know that it's reverent. There's a deep respect here for the almighty Creator who made him. We know it's obedient. We know that he trusts the Lord to the point that he's willing to follow his word wherever it may lead him. We know it is an attentive look. It's focused on him and not distracted by idols or any other things or people that he would want to put before God. It's expectant. It's full of hope. He's ready for the Lord to deliver him. He knows that good things are in the future. He's anticipating something better. It's focused. Again, it's not distracted. It's alert to the Lord. It's submissive, willing and obedient to do whatever the Lord would have him do. And finally, it's imploring. It's prayerful. It's on its knees asking the Lord to help. This is what we find when we look at this individual in isolation. He's alone right now. He's longing to be with the assembly, but he's not idle. He's lifting up his eyes to the heavens, to the one who is ready and willing to help him, to the Lord God. Well, let's move to the second place. As this psalm progresses, we see it move from the individual to thoughts of the assembly. We'll call this the assembly anticipated. And the psalmist joins the assembly either in his imagination or in reality on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And as he does, he cries out with the assembly 3 times for mercy. Look at this, starting in verse 2. Our eyes look to the Lord our God till he has mercy upon us. Have mercy upon us, O Lord. Have mercy upon us, for we have had more than enough of contempt. You notice he's crying out for mercy. We'll talk about why in just a moment. But before we get to that, I want you to notice that as he anticipates the assembly, or even as he joins it in reality, he cries out with the assembly, with his brothers and sisters, for mercy. He desires a togetherness with them to make that cry, to make that prayer for compassion to the Lord. And that introduces to us a very important function of the assembly. It may suggest why so many of us are missing getting together with our brothers and sisters. Here's the thought that it introduces, that we come together for many reasons, but one of the reasons we come together as the church to worship in a corporate manner is for encouragement. There's a lot of encouragement that we get from our brothers and our sisters in Jesus Christ. And obviously, the psalmist here is looking for encouragement from his assembly as well. I'll give you a couple of examples of how the assembly or the group or the brothers and sisters can be such an encouragement. You know the story of Elijah and how he defeated the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18. When we come to 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah is very distraught. He's depressed and he's longing to die because he's all alone. Twice the Lord asked him in that chapter, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And both times he says, even I alone am serving you. I'm all alone. There's nobody with me. But the Lord revealed to him something very important, something that lifted his spirits. He told him there were 7,000 who had not bowed their knees to Baal. What an encouragement to know that he wasn't alone. So you have that example, and then over in the New Testament, you have this passage of Scripture from Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. We use it a lot about the assembly. We need to look at it carefully to see what it is saying. Sometimes we use it just to tell people that they're sinning for not coming to the assembly. And if you leave the assembly because you're forsaking it or you don't want to be a part of God's people, that is a very serious sin. But what is he saying about what happens in the assembly? What's the positive reinforcement here? Let's read it. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. What was so special about the assembly? Why was it so important that Christians not neglect it or forsake it? Because that's where we stir one another up to love and good works. The assembly is where we encourage one another. It's an encouragement. And that's why we see the psalmist crying out for mercy over and over again as he starts to think, either in his imagination or in reality, about the assembly, because that's where the encouragement is. And that's why we want to be together. In the Old Testament, before Christ, God's presence was symbolized by the temple in Jerusalem. And on special occasions, the Israelites would go, as we see them depicted in this song of ascent, and they would enjoy the assembly. As rare as it was, they would enjoy the encouragement of seeing so many faithful people to the Lord worshiping together. Now in the New Testament age, we know the church is God's temple. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. And we gather together not just once a year or a few special occasions, but every first day of the week and then during the week on several occasions. And we're able to do that wherever we are, and whatever size group we are, we're there together and we encourage one another. And we haven't been able to do that lately. And it's been difficult, especially for those who are in strict isolation, who may live alone. We know it's temporary. We know that soon we'll get back together. And one of the reasons we really want to be back together again is because of the encouragement and the love that we'll find there. Now, let's turn to the third place, to some others who aren't worshipers at all, who are outside the assembly and who are responsible for this threefold cry for mercy. These are the proud who are outside the assembly. And notice what he says about them. Have mercy on us, O Lord, verse 3. Have mercy upon us, for we have had more than enough of contempt. Our soul has had more than enough of the scorn of those who are at ease, of the contempt of the proud. So there were others who weren't believers, maybe along the way, maybe in other places, who were looking at the worshipers with scorn and with contempt. And the language that is used here where he says, we've had more than enough of contempt, has to do with the idea of being satiated or being filled up to the brim with contempt. He's had enough of it. This language here caused Charles Spurgeon to comment about this psalm that it's more of a sigh than a song. You can see that they're fed up with the contempt they've been shown, and they're praying to the Lord for mercy because of it. And these scorners that are showing contempt towards them, they're not in trouble themselves. They're not poor. They're not showing contempt because life has been hard or troublesome to them. They are at ease, which makes, on top of the scorn, you feel this sense of injustice that is being committed against them. It's very difficult for these as they head to Jerusalem for worship and feel that contempt from the people who are on the outside. But here's something that we know that the psalmist didn't know. We know that eventually God would come down and He would bear the contempt borne by His people because of the scornful and because of those who show contempt. And Peter writes about this in a very special passage, 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 19. Here's what Peter says. This is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in His steps. He continues, He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in His mouth. When He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By His wounds you have been healed. We know now that God was willing to come and suffer the contempt that the people of Israel suffered on behalf of unbelievers who treated them with scorn. And we know that this is our purpose. We know that there's one whom we can trust who will bring us to glory just as He brought Jesus to glory through the cross. And so, as Peter says, to this we have been called. This is what the assembly is all about. It's about going through this world and its trials together, bracing one another up, encouraging one another against circumstances beyond our control, against the enemies of Christ who mock and treat us with contempt. That's what life is all about. And we have such a wonderful purpose. We have such a wonderful reason to get together. Well, as we bring this to a close, I want us to think about a very important thought. The thought of anticipation. Anticipation is really what makes this psalm, Psalm 123, it really makes it sing. This idea of anticipation reminds me of the book by C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In that book, these children visit this fantasy land called Narnia. And Narnia is controlled at the moment by an evil villain, but there is word that this lion named Aslan is coming. And the first time you hear the lion's name is when some beavers are talking to the children, and they say this phrase, Aslan is coming. And the mention of the name Aslan evokes mixed reaction among the children and the others who are standing around. And I want to read to you the portion of the book where that happens. The beavers say, Aslan is coming. And then this is how it continues. Now, a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream, that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. Edmund felt the sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it is just the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer? Do you sense the anticipation he's trying to evoke in that passage from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Something special. I bet it's the anticipation felt by the Israelites when they're on their way to the temple in Jerusalem for that once-a-year experience, maybe a couple times a year, to go to the temple anticipating the sounds and the smells and the sights that excited them so much to see so many fellow believers around. It's the anticipation that we feel as we're in isolation right now, under quarantine, not able to worship together, waiting for that day when we can sing together and pray together, take communion together, embrace one another, and lift each other up. It's the same anticipation that we feel now, knowing that God is with us, but not fully in our presence as He will one day be. And the word is, Christ is on the move. Christ is coming. And we anticipate that with great joy. We must be patient. We must wait. Christ is coming.